This is Alex with MasterChartsTrading.com, and this is special 75th anniversary edition of Victory in Europe Day. Today, 75 years ago, the Allies received a surrender from Nazi Germany in Berlin. So what I want to do with today's presentation is just kind of go over the various events that occurred during the lead up to the World War II and during the World War II itself, and try to see if there is anything that we can deduce from the events that are happening by looking at the stock market chart. And we will look at the charts that were back in the days from the 30s, late 20s into the 30s and into the 40s. 1940s. So what I'll do is I will go over some of the events that happened, and again, if you just don't like this or don't really care, just fast forward. This is probably going to be a relatively sizable presentation because I have quite a bit of charts and information to share. So if you're not really interested, simply fast forward and you will see my later on I will cover today's stocks and the action in the stock market. But for now, let's just kind of dip back into the history and see what are the events that were happening back in the days. So we need to look first to understand World War II. We need to understand World War I, and World War I ended in 1918 with Germany being severely punished at the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was made to repay lots of money for the starting of the war, and it was blamed for the war. So this actually kind of led to the formation of various parties in Germany and around the world, such as communists, and eventually in Germany a Nazi party. So Nazi is an abbreviation of German for National Socialist German Workers' Party. This happened in 1920s, and Hitler, joined this. He's right there in this photograph. He became one of the primary speakers for the Nazi Party, and he embodied the philosophy of, first of all, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish sentiment, anti-communism, so obviously against anything Soviet Russia does, and as well as disdain for democracy. So I will show that Hitler actually kind of used the democratic process to hijack power in Germany and thus sway the people to do the things that he was hoping to do. And he was opposed to Treaty of Versailles, obviously, that he didn't think that Germany was responsible for starting the war. But the biggest thing, of course, is Germany's right to territorial expansion, and this what led to military conflicts in the 1930s and 1940s. So Hitler here, you can see he was a powerful speaker. He was very charismatic speaker, and many people in Germany and actually around the world at that time followed his philosophy and sympathized with his philosophy. And so I'm going to just read this. This is from a former member of Hitler Youth. We erupted into a frenzy of nationalistic pride that bordered on hysteria. For minutes on end we shouted at the top of our lungs with tears streaming down our faces, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. From that moment on, I belonged to Adolf Hitler body and soul. So you can see that people were extremely swayed by this charismatic leader, and he was able to hijack the democratic process, and he was able to actually become a leader of Germany, democratically elected leader, but then he became a chancellor of Germany and eventually a dictator of Germany. Now let's look at the actual stocks, the stock market back in the days. And back in the days, as Nazi power in Germany was rising, in the United States we had stock market crash in 1929, followed by Great Depression, New Deal, Roosevelt elected president, and isolationist policies in the US. So let's look at the stock market here, and I'm going to be using my indicators again. So this green, blue, red, yellow lines, they are my proprietary trading indicators that are called MasterCharts Trading Price Action Indicators. And here on this chart, I'm going to show that actually you don't really need any fancy education, or you don't need any insider knowledge to be able to successfully trade stocks. So for example, this is a graph, a daily chart of Dow Jones Industrial Average from 1929. So the crash started, well, obviously there was a top. Here's the top on the 3rd of September 1929. Then, prices just came down. Here you can see an actual, I would be buying here if I was alive, and if I was, possessive of a capital, I would be buying here on the 4th of October. And I probably would have made a little bit of money. But then we can see a big market collapse here. And then following that, you can see a downward facing arrow right here on the 31st of October 1929. So if I had an opportunity to short the stock market right there, I would have done it. And I would have probably been labeled as a evil short seller of some sort. I would have been successful, and you can see several opportunities to enter throughout the 1930, downside. Then the stock market continued to slide and keep sliding for actually multiple years. So this was the time of stock market crash, Great Depression. You can see this famous picture of a woman with 2 children, just don't know what to do, basically. As the things were getting very tough in Europe as well, United States public did not really want to entangle itself with European theater, and there was what's called isolationist policies. In other words, the United States was determined to be kept out of European conflicts of any sort. And this actually continued for a while until finally in December of 1941 there was an attack on Pearl Harbor, followed by a declaration of war on the United States by Germany and Italy. And I'll actually cover it in a few because it's an interesting topic. So we continue in the 1930s, 1931, the Great Depression continues, lots of people out of work. Additionally, there was what's called a dust bowl, so there was a failure of crops. So a lot of issues, obviously, in the 1920s, in the 1930s through 1932, 33. So here is another opportunity. You can see in the September of 1932, we would have been able to short again the stock market, but we were not terribly successful because here, so we get November elections, and here's November elections. Roosevelt was elected president, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president. The first 100 days of presidency begins in March, April of 1933. You can see that immediately the stock market reacted very positively to this happening, and basically took off right after. Many of the policies were implemented. You can read about New Deal in the Wikipedia, or there are many books. So you can see opportunities to buy. Now here around 1934 there was a opportunity to sell. Actually, it would have been successful, but not terribly successful, because again the bull market would resume just in a few days, a month, and this continued for a while. So we're now in 1935, and in 1930s the German Nazi Party began a campaign to systematically frame Jews as the enemy responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I, which was important, and the subsequent economic disaster. So, in other words, the Great Depression was not just felt in the United States. The Great Depression was worldwide. So, this is, in a sense, kind of similar to what we're seeing happening right now. We're seeing global recession or global depression. So one of the easiest thing, of course, is to blame somebody and blame somebody else for the economic problems or social problems. So this was already happening in the 1930s, and there were already pogroms against Jews and Nazis taking over Germany. There were hard laws coming down and excluding Jews and many other people from livelihood, and sometimes outright deporting or killing them as well. So this is a time between 1935, 1936, 37. You can see a big, still big bull market. You can see opportunities to enter, for example, here in April of 1936. Lots of opportunities to buy. So what was happening here? We're seeing what's called an appeasement to Hitler. So Hitler was, as I already mentioned, he was determined to expand territorially. And first he expanded into Austria, and then he would expand into Czechoslovakian lands of Sudetenland, where German-speaking people lived. And in a sense, France and United Kingdom, since they were the great powers at the time, they did what's called an appeasement. So they were hoping that Hitler would just take a little bit and stop, and then this is going to be the final demand. The German occupation of Czechoslovakian lands were the final demand, and this was actually happening. And Neil Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister at the time, it is a famous photograph where he's holding a peaceful for our time letter, such as agreement between Britain and Germany that there will be no more territorial demands, and this happened in September 30th, 1938. So let's see what was happening back, at that time rather. So here in 1937 to 1938, we're seeing a small, relatively small recession in the United States. So the stock market actually, continued lower. Appeasement of Hitler to avoid full-scale war. So this is the event around September of 1938, the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Notice that appeasement actually worked as far as the stock market goes. It did terrible things in Europe, and it did terrible things to the people that are being occupied by the Germans, by the German Nazis. But the stock market did quite well, and since the United States were still very much isolationist and did not want to get involved with the European war, you can see the stock market did again quite well. And only later, about a year later, in 1939. So in 1939, we're seeing several interesting events that occurred. Number one is a Pact of Steel, which is signed between Germany and Italy, creating an axis of power. In other words, an axis along Italian-German collaboration, I guess. So they signed a Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy, signed the pact with Germany, and this pact was later joined by Japan. This is important for the United States because once we get to Pearl Harbor, it would make more sense. Additionally, Stalin, the Soviet leader, made a pact with Germany, a non-aggression pact, but it's called a Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, and it basically partitioned Europe into spheres of influence, and unfortunately Poland was in the way, and we can see that this is what happened after the partition, or rather after the signing of the pact, August 23rd, 1939. You can see 7 days later, Germany invades Poland from the west, while Russian troops invade from the east. But the point of the matter is, Britain and France actually were bound by an agreement with Poland to as a mutual protection pact, basically. So if an attack happened on Poland, then then France and Britain would declare war on the aggressor, and they did. So this is the technical beginning of World War II, September 1st, 1939. So September 1st, 1939. Right there, as crazy as it sounds, this is an outbreak of war, and look what happened. This is exactly where you want to be buying, right? You want to be buying this stock market because the signal is there. So yeah, it's really interesting because you can't really compare stock market to the world events, right? But yet some people just persist. They want to say that they can predict the future based on the events. This is the beginning of a huge war, and stock market is going higher. So why is that happening? It's a completely different subject. The point of the matter is, if you were a stock market participant, you would want to be buying here. You did not want to be shorting yet. Now, during this time between 1939 and around 1940 or so, there was something called a phony war. In other words, there was not really any kind of military conflict between Britain and France and Germany. Even though they were technically at war at the time, there was some limited action until May 10th, 1940, and this is actually very visible on the stock market chart. There is May 10, 1940, invasion of Low Countries and France by the Germany. So here, this is an honest to goodness collapse, and if we were long, if we wanted to be buying here in January of 1940, we would want to be exiting very soon here, and we would have exited here and then avoided a significant loss afterwards. So this period here between May and September 1940, and then you can see Franklin Delano Roosevelt wins a third term, and it was an unprecedented third term as a president. However, it did little to allay the fears, and the stock market continued lower. So we're now somewhere in the in the beginning of 1941, and around September 1940-1941, finally the hostilities have commenced, and there was an air war and blitz eventually, where Germany attacked Britain by airplanes. There were many bombings here of British cities, and in a sense it galvanized the resistance to the German aggression by the British. So it actually achieved in exactly the wrong kind of effect. In June of 22nd of June 1941, Germany invades Soviet Union. So, well, actually before that there was a couple of actions on the Western Front when the France was invaded. France fell within just a couple of months, basically. However, many of the troops were saved during the Dunkirk evacuation, and many of the Free French troops that were stationed later on in Britain, including Charles de Gaulle, that led the eventual return of the French troops during the D-Day. So again, air war and blitz in Germany, rather in Britain. You can see the widespread destruction and bombing of British cities by the German Air Force. Pearl Harbor attack. So this occurred in December 1941, but before that, this actually a little bit opposite. I misplaced one of the slides. So Operation Barbarossa, and this is an invasion of Soviet Union which commenced on June 22nd, 1941. Because I was born in Soviet Russia, I am very much familiar with the effect of the war on the Russian and Soviet population. My grandparents participated very much in World War II. One of them was in an active fighting unit. He was in the communication corps. And then another of my grandfathers, he was a medical doctor. He was working on something very similar to MASH unit. But they were not, like in Korean War, they were on the trains. They were train-based evacuation hospital. But the point of the matter is, Operation Barbarossa, invasion of Soviet Union, starts what's called the Great Patriotic War, that is known as Great Patriotic War of 1941 to 1945 for the Soviet-Russian population. This apparently was the most lethal conflict in human history, with over 30 million dead. So this number most likely includes civilians that were dead from some of the genocide and from the starvation, basically. Okay, so there's the invasion of the Soviet Union, June 22nd, right there, where I'm hovering. Nothing really happened, and actually, if you were kind of bearish, maybe you shorted here, but then you would have probably got stopped out a few days later. Overall, stock market reacted negatively, and eventually, closer to the end of 1941, there was a significant downdraft, and it continued into 1942. So this, my personal opinion of the reason why stock market turned around eventually here in 1942 is, I think, because of the Battle of Stalingrad, which was the turning point of World War II. So read up about Battle of Stalingrad. Extremely bloody and just a terrible battle that took place. Many hundreds of thousands, I think millions of soldiers on both sides died in this relatively long battle from 23rd of August into February 1943. You can see Stalingrad. This is a very famous fountain that I think was preserved in Stalingrad. Now it's Volgograd, but back then it was Stalingrad. So the Germans were stopped at the Stalingrad, and you can see, for example, here's Marshal Paulus surrendered to Russian Soviet troops. Vast majority of the German troops that surrounded the Russians ended up dead eventually, because they were sent to the camps in Siberia, and they were not treated nicely. So the turnaround in World War II, I think, happened here. Again, turnaround in World War II and turnaround in the stock market. You can see a clear breakout where I'm hovering on 8th of October 1942. It's interesting because I actually read up, and this is exactly like just around this time, around early November, late October, the Soviet troops launched a encircling offensive to trap the armies led by the Marshal Paulus, and eventually that led to their demise. So next few shots are a little bit disturbing, so it's just like a warning. During the war, Nazi Germany, engaged in atrocities and genocide against civilian population. Here you can see several families being deported by the German soldiers. Just a very sad shot. If you have kids, most likely all of these people would have been killed in the concentration camps. So concentration camps were used by the Germans to do many things. For example, there were work camps. There were where prisoners would be worked, and usually they would be worked to death. This particular photograph here of naked men, this is actually a POW, prisoners of war camp, that you can see they are most likely all going to die because of the dystrophy. This is something that we should remember, and we should do our very best to never repeat again. And excuse me, there is some sound. So do our very best to not allow to happen again, basically. Now, during the war, of course, United States did not join until 1941, and United States haven't been involved in the land war until very late in the conflict. In 1944, when the D-Day invasion happened, that's when the United States got involved. But in a sense, United States got involved significantly earlier, around 1941, I believe, when the Japan, excuse me, let me see, where is that? Can't find it for some reason. When the Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, eventually Japan and the United States declared war on Japan. But because Japan was a part of the Axis powers, immediately the Germany and Italy declared war on United States. So this was 1941. So in 1941, as I already said, so the Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941. This is about right there. And then eventually, like I said, war was declared on Italy, or rather Italy and Germany declared war on the United States. So from here on, United States was no longer in isolation, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt began a program of what's called Lend-Lease. So these are, America just had enormous industrial capacity, and this is what I'm hopeful for in this particular new crisis with COVID, is that the United States will eventually, get back on its feet and start doing something similar to what was happening during World War II. So Lend-Lease provided a lot of materials, such as, for example, this truck right there. This is a Studebaker. So you can see that this is a rocket launcher. It's called Katyusha, and it's mounted on a Studebaker, produced in the United States, because the United States really supplied enormous amounts of war material to the Allies, and not only war material but also food stuff and just raw materials as well. So without this help from the United States, there was absolutely no way Russia would have defeated, or it would have taken even longer, and it would have been a lot more costlier as well. So overall, Lend-Lease was a stunning success, basically, in my book, as it helped to finally put a nail in the coffin of the Nazi Germany in 1945. Looking at our stock market again, so again, the Battle of Stalingrad was again lots of material from the United States, so trucks, tanks, food, ammunitions, clothing, military uniform, just a lot of material came from the United States with the shipments. And so the government was spending a lot of money, and you can see the stock market was going higher because the companies were making money from producing various things needed in war. Again, an opportunity here, for example, in 1943 to buy, and another one back in 1944. So here finally we're seeing Allies land in Germany in June of 1944. The stock market just took off even higher. Several opportunities again here. So the landing on D-Day invasion of Normandy, a big deal. It's what's called Second Front. So the Russian war on the Eastern Front, but there was really no Western Front per se, because France was occupied, Low Countries were occupied. So finally, when the United States, Canada, Britain, Free French troops landed in Normandy on D-Day and eventually broke out of Normandy. Enormous operation, very interesting. I highly recommend people look up information about this. This eased the burden on the Soviet troops on the Eastern Front, as war was happening now on two ends, from both East and West in Germany. The stock market continued higher, and we're basically already here in 1944, end of 1944, March in 1945. You can see an opportunity again to buy here, and then finally a victory in Europe. Well, before that happened, I wanted to show this slide. This is an important piece of historical documentation. It's history. United States and Soviet troops meet at Torgau, Germany. So this implied that no more, the Germany was basically split in half from the south and north, and from the east it was pressed by the Soviet Union, from the west by the Allies. So this was a big deal. My grandpa actually told me he met Germans in he met United States troops in Torgau, Germany. This is my father's father. So I don't think that's him, but he told me stories about this type of thing, where he saw people, American troops, doing this kind of thing. They were just driving like crazy on their jeeps, and he had big admiration for them. And they were basically extremely happy, because this basically means that encirclement of the German Reich, and it's very close to the end of the World War II. Of course, we need to remember our commanders. Dwight Eisenhower, United States Supreme Allied Commander. George Patton, again, of the United States. Georgy Zhukov of USSR, Marshal of USSR, and Bernard Montgomery of Great Britain. I already mentioned Charles de Gaulle a little bit earlier, of Free French troops. But overall, finally, Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945. Germany surrenders, and you can see there was really no opportunity to buy at this time, but a time of great celebration, a time of finally there was an end to this horror of many years, and you can see Victory in Europe Day, May 8th, 1945, but celebrated May 9th in many countries in Eastern Europe. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the current events.